Our next presenter will be Valli Parthasarathy. She is a board certified behaviorist for a veterinary specialty practice. In today's session, she will be speaking about veterinary aspects of avian enrichment. Valli, go ahead and take it.
Wonderful. Can everybody hear me okay? All right,
Yes.
I got a thumbs up. Excellent. Well, I'm just in awe of all the presentations I've been seeing so far this morning and this afternoon. It's been just amazing to hear just the wonderful ideas and enrichments that people have been discussing over the course of this day. So my hope is to pull some of this together in how it is that I work with some of my patients when I see citizens. Citizens tend to be the most common of the birds that I tend to see. And so let's dive into that for the next little bit. So I'm a veterinary behaviorist, and let me go ahead and there we go. Moving too fast. Excellent. So I'm a veterinary behaviorist. And so one of the questions that I get asked is, well, what is a veterinary behaviorist? And so I am a veterinarian, and I did a residency focusing on behavior. So the way that I kind of think about this is that I play a role sort of like a combination, someone who works with the brain as far as the brain neurochemistry side of things, and then also on the behavior. So a little bit like psychiatry, a little bit like psychology, but more dealing with the animals that we spend our lives with. So my goal in my practice is to diagnose and treat generally unwanted behavioral conditions, generally unwanted from the human perspective, but then also to help assess whether or not the behaviors that we're seeing are normal versus abnormal. So when I look at behaviors, oftentimes because of the population of animals that I see, I tend to look at it from the perspective of what are the problems, what are the behaviors that are unwanted, and what can we do to try to facilitate either understanding by the person who owns these animals, and or how do we then allow these animals to practice the behaviors that they need to have fulfilled lives. So when we look at the research as far as what is reported about behavioral conditions and problems, most owners report to their veterinarians about, or when owners are surveyed, they tend to report behaviors like aggressive behaviors, so biting, aggressive screaming, flying at an aggressive manner, those sorts of behaviors, screaming, so vocalizations. And for those of you who are around citizens, like we saw in this previous videos with some of these other birds, they can be very loud. And feather destructive behavior or feather picking tend to be the big three that clients report when they're asked what it is that they see. And then from the veterinarian standpoint, the things that they report that are sort of behavioral are feather destructive behaviors, chronic egg laying, and then also aggression and screaming. So you can see that aggression and screaming are two very common, very important behaviors to be aware of, as well as feather destructive behavior. So when I'm thinking about how do I look at a particular patient and figure out how can I best help them, I think about the 5 domains of basically welfare. Some of you may be aware of the 5 freedoms that were developed. And they were some good guidelines on how we can think about the freedom of disease and the freedom of fear. But we're starting to move towards now not just the freedom of things that we don't like, but how can we actually promote the things that are beneficial? So in the 5 domains area, one domain is nutrition. So are we sure that this animal that we're working on, because most of these animals that I work with are pets. So are they getting appropriate, adequate nutrition for their age, for their species, for their breeding status? Next, I think about their environment. And so, is their environment something that is enriching? We'll talk a little bit more about that. What is it that could be put into their environment to allow them to promote the behaviors that we're looking for? Is the environment something that is adequate for that size species as well? The health, so general physical health, behavior, And then, so are they able to practice species typical behavior, and are they actually able to, and are a full range, or is there a wide range of these species typical behaviors that are able to be, that are being utilized? And then their mental state. So what is their actual emotional state? And this is one of the ones that's a little bit different in the 5 domains, because it's not just looking at the behavior, but it's also saying what is this animal's emotional state like? Are we in a positive or negative or a neutral emotional state? And so the way that I think about enrichment is I think of enrichment as a part of a cohesive treatment plan. In these past lectures that we've had this morning, like I said, I have been amazed at the amount of ideas and just the insights that have been going into the types of enrichment that are there. So I don't want to spend a lot of time going into all the different types of enrichment, because I think that our previous speakers have done a fabulous job with that. But I do want to talk a little bit about how I might decide on what sort of enrichment I might decide for a particular issue, or for particular birds, some of the thought process that I have. So enrichment is always part of a cohesive treatment plan. And the reason for that is that I have clients who come to me with a really wide range of knowledge when it comes to their birds. I have some clients who have had years and years of experience, and they have high levels of environmental enrichment. However, maybe the enrichment is not actually allowing the bird to utilize the environment in the best way. Or maybe there's a lot of enrichment, but the bird is actually not engaging with it. So I look at how can we help this bird utilize this environment. And the other thing that I think about is that most unwanted behaviors in birds, um, by and large, when we talk about aggressive behavior and when we talk about screaming specifically, those are, and when we think about destructiveness as well, most of the unwanted behaviors that people come to me for are normal behaviors in birds. And so trying to figure out how can we utilize the enrichment to help with this. So in general, when I'm addressing a bird having an unwanted behavior, um, I take a good look at both of the history of this bird, both the behavioral history and the medical history. When I'm working with avian species, I often work in conjunction with their primary veterinarian, and so collaborate with them on what it might be additional treatments to consider, other additional blood works to consider, things like that. But I do look at the medical background, as well as the behavioral background, and we'll talk a little bit more about why I do that. But both of those are very important for us to figure out what it is might be going on. Why may some of these behaviors be maintained? Because one of the speakers earlier said behaviors happen for a reason. And so how can we determine what that reason is? And then also an assessment of the environment. How large is the enclosure? Where is the enclosure in the house? How much time do they spend in that enclosure? What sort of wingspan does this bird have compared to the enclosure that it has, and the location of this enclosure, and how much time do they have outside of that, and what sort of enrichment do they have as well? So I mentioned that most behaviors are health related, which is absolutely true. But we do have to keep in mind that you can have also health related, or excuse me, most of them are normal, but you can have health related behaviors changes as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Um, Many behaviors have an anxiety or a fear component. If they have anxiety or fear, that doesn't mean it's abnormal necessarily, but it's important for people to realize, the clients to realize, that there may be an anxiety component or a fear component that's there. Or there may be an emotional arousal component. So emotional arousal, when I think about emotional arousal, I describe it as a bird who gets really emotionally worked up and is really kind of aroused and excited and doesn't know what to do with itself. And so you can have a lot of unwanted behaviors coming from that as well. So birds, from a health perspective, the first sign of a medical condition often is a behavioral change. The problem is that birds are awesome at hiding when they're sick. So oftentimes people who have a bird who's not feeling well may not realize that that bird is not feeling well until that bird is pretty far along with whatever illness that it has. So one of the things that I always recommend my clients do is teach their birds to get up on a scale so that they can, and to weigh them at a particular time, either generally before a meal, so that we can have a consistent weight, because as we know, once birds have eaten a big full meal, they can be somewhat heavier than other times. So, getting clients to get comfortable and getting the birds to be comfortable with getting weights on a regular basis is really important, because sometimes the first thing that we start seeing is that the weight starts changing, and you can start, and sometimes, especially because they have these beautiful feathers on them, you can't see that weight change is happening until they're pretty skinny. So very, very important thing that I recommend that my clients do. So as we talk about this, let's see, whoops, I missed a slide in here somewhere. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of examples here. So we have feather destructive behavior and aggressive behavior. And when I have a patient who comes to me with either of these, I want to make sure that they've had a really good medical workup, because what we do know is that for what's considered, or sort of the general feather destructive behavior or feather picking, there's a lot of reasons medically for why a bird may be losing feathers or may be going after their own feathers. So for example, any sort of dermatologic condition, skin condition that causes itchiness, so allergies, any sort of mites infestations, any sort of other fungal or viral infections, bacterial infections, any of those can cause them to feel, their skin to feel wrong. And so they can start picking at themselves because of that. They can also have, or certain diseases can cause feathers to just come out. So it's really important when you have feather loss to make sure that you rule out all the medical conditions that could be contributing to that. Now, something to consider is that if you have a bird who has maybe some feathers gone from its chest, but then also feathers gone from the top of its head, and it's the only bird in the area, in the enclosure or in the house, then we're much more likely looking at a medical condition, because a bird can't pick its own head, right? So that's something that's also important to think about, is where is the feather picking occurring, and can their beak actually reach that area? So in certain cases, they can get severe enough that they're actually mutilating themselves. And then now we also have that pain of the injury that also can cause them to chew at themselves more. So that medical part of it is very, very important for these guys. Other conditions that could cause sort of destructive behavior or self-injurious behavior, liver conditions, any pain in the abdomen can cause that as well. Some liver conditions can cause them to have poor feather growth. So these are all things to consider. For aggression, similarly, anything that causes physical discomfort can lead to aggressive behavior, because anything that causes a pet to be more uncomfortable is going to have them a little bit more on edge. And if they're a little bit more on edge, they're more likely to act in an aggressive or reactive manner, to be sort of self-defensive. So things to think about again is, orthopedic pain, neurologic pain, dermatologic pain, gastrointestinal pain. Hunger can cause them to be kind of snippish. I know I get hangry, so birds can get hangry too. This is a very scientific term. But we need to think about these things. Something else to consider when we're talking about something like feather destructive behavior also, and I'm not going to delve too much into it because that is a topic all into itself, but there are certain species of birds that are more likely to have it, or more prone to it. So for example, African gray parrots, cockatoos, macaws are more prone to behavioral feather destructive behavior compared to some of the other birds that are out there. So those are some of the top 3 ones, but there are others. So those are some things that are really important to consider if you have a bird who is showing some of these behavioral conditions. So we may have a medical component, not just purely behavioral. Now, as an aside, you can have hormonal changes that can occur during certain times of the year, or once they hit puberty, which can also impact their behavior. So that's something also that's important to consider. All right, so here's just a side view of the brain. This pathway that we're having here is actually more related to songbird pathway, but I just wanted to show there was in the last presentation there was a really great description of the HPA axis and the impacts of stress on birds and animals in general. What I wanted to point out though was that there's a couple of different types of stress, if you want to call it there. There's eustress and distress, and acute versus chronic stress. So acute versus chronic. So eustress, the way I think about that is that so if we're going to have any sort of engagement with the environment, there needs to be some sort of impetus for it. And that impetus usually is due to some sort of stress. There's something that's promoting that interest in engaging with the environment. And that's what eustress is. Eustress is, hey, something's going on. I want to check it out. I think that, I want to pay attention to this. So that's kind of the eustress. It promotes engagement with the environment. Sometimes people consider play a part of eustress. Sometimes some people may consider a little bit of fright or a little bit of stress that the bird can work through as eustress as well. I think there's a little bit of more of a gray area about that. Distress, the way I think about distress is that we are having a negative physiologic or emotional response related to some sort of stimulus. And generally, this distress is not pleasant. You can have acute distress where you have maybe a bird who gets startled by something or scared by something, but they can recover. Or you can have chronic distress. And chronic is where you may have the bird, like was mentioned in the previous example, in the previous presentation, the bird who has no stimulation at all. And so this bird is in a state of chronic distress because there's nothing for this bird to do. So recognizing stress in birds, there's going to be species differences when you're when you're looking at this. So, but with most of the cetaceans, most of the pet birds that we see, they may have, their eyes might be really round versus sort of more relaxed and almond shaped. So they may have very round eyes. They might refuse food. They may stop grooming. They may sort of slick down their feathers when they're and kind of crunch in if they're uncomfortable. Other things that you may see is you may see that they might partially open their wings. They may lean away. If they're flighted, they may fly away. If they may vocalize, do a distress vocalization. They may lunge, they may bite. And when I think about aggressive behavior, a lot of times clients will say, hey, this bite came out of nowhere. And oftentimes the reason why clients are saying that is because they're not seeing or they're not recognizing these earlier signs, like the bird opening up the wings a little bit, leaning away a little bit, maybe trying to move away, and maybe the bird can't move away any further. And then the bird then lunges and bites. But they didn't see all the buildup to that. So that's something that's a very important part of what I talk about is how do we start helping the client see these little steps first before the bite or the lunge occurs. For arousal, emotional arousal, you may have fluffing of the feathers. This can be also birds species specific. So for example, with the cockatoos, they tend to bring their crests up very high and they tend to stand really high. Sometimes they start really bobbing their heads really fast. You might have pinning of the pupils in these birds. You might have with African greys, when they start getting really aroused or really upset, they can start puffing up into a little football, sort of dipping their heads and puffing up. So you can start seeing some of these signs as well to indicate that they're moving into a state of, they're moving into this state of distress. And also emotional arousal can be distressing as well, because oftentimes with birds, as they get more and more emotionally aroused, that can lead to more aggressive behavior as well. So when I am trying to put it together a diagnosis for why it is a bird is showing a particular unwanted behavior. I'll look for, the species predilections. So what is it based on the species? What are underlying reasons for why it might be happening? And what are what are also some of the underlying motivations for why why these particular behaviors are going on? So for example, I won't diagnose a bird as aggressive, just as aggressive, because a bird, no bird is going to be aggressive 100% of the time, right? There's some reason for why that bird is showing aggressive behavior. And so part of my job is to figure out, why is this bird showing aggressive behavior? Is the bird showing aggressive behavior because we are fearful? Is it because we're doing mate guarding type behavior? Is it because we're doing some territorial behavior around the nest? What is the context in which this aggressive behavior is happening? Because once we find out the context in which this behavior is happening, then we can start moving towards treatment. And when I look at treatment, I start looking at, okay, what enrichment would be appropriate for this bird? What diet would be appropriate for this bird? What management do we need to do to help this bird be successful, and the people be successful too? Because oftentimes by the time people come to me, their relationship with their bird is really strained. We know how strong the relationship people can have with birds, and it's really hard for everybody when that relationship is strained. Um, Behavior modifications and potentially medications. So I'll touch on all of these. Um, so as we move forward, um, when I think about considerations for enrichment, I think about species appropriate behavior and species appropriate enrichment. So for example, I mean, even if we think about just even with the citizens, the enrichment that we select for this macaw is going to be different from the enrichment that we might select for a lovebird or a cockatiel, just sheerly because of their size, right? So we need to make sure that we pick something that's appropriate for that species. And that promotes particular species tendencies. So if we have a bird that tends to be more of a ground foraging bird, can we set up an environment so that they can do more foraging from the ground? Versus if we have a bird that tends to sit up in the trees and forage, can we set up that sort of environment for them? But we also need to think of it as being appropriate for that individual. Like was mentioned in some of the other presentations today, some things that might great for some individuals may not work well for other individuals. And it's really important to think about enrichment kind of like a game of discovery. I mean, we're trying to discover what it is that what is it that this individual really, really likes to do? And how can we teach that individual to do things that will promote the type of enrichment behaviors that we are trying to get them going with? And so enrichment tools and enrichment in the enclosures or in the environment should allow a little bit of eustress, where they should be interested in exploring it, maybe interested in playing with it, but should avoid distress. Again, thinking about this, what species appropriate enclosure and complexity. So oftentimes clients will have a sleeping arrangement, like a sleeping enclosure, and then a waking enclosure. So the sleeping enclosure, maybe it's not going to have very much in it, maybe a really comfortable couple comfortable perches. We want to make sure it can be covered so that people are not having, so the bird has good 12 hours of sleep. And we want to make sure that it's nice and quiet in a really quiet place. Whereas the day enclosure, or if they're out and around the house during the course of the day, is that something, what sort of complexity is there? And is it appropriate for that individual? Again, diet and foraging opportunities, making those species specific as well. And then also thinking about positive social interactions. Are those going to be intra-species interactions? So for example, if you have other birds in the house, are they the same species? Are we going to allow them to be together or engage with each other? Sometimes that works out great, sometimes not so much. So being aware of if we're having interactions with other individuals, those should be positive interactions, because of course we're going to increase distress if we have them be negative. And then also interspecies, so between species. So that's going to be if you have multiple species in the house, birds and dogs, birds and cats, birds and people. All of those, we have to figure out how can we make these as positive interactions as possible to make sure that these pets have as good as distress-free environments as possible. So looking at the individuals, then we want to look at what their preferences are. I was already talking a little bit about how this is a little bit of a game of detective work. But we also need to think about the fears that an individual may have. So if we know that a particular bird has a fear of, objects hanging from the cage ceiling, maybe we won't start with that as their form of enrichment. Maybe we'll start with something on the table. Maybe we'll start with something that's on the floor of the cage. Maybe we'll start with something that looks very different, but is something, maybe instead of a toy that's hanging, maybe we start with a fruit that's hanging, something that they really, really love and maybe are more willing to engage with that doesn't look like the toys that frighten them. And then we have to also think about the medical considerations. So, is there any pain or any physical abilities? One of the previous talks talked about the bird with cerebellar issues and how that bird couldn't balance, but yet that they were able to figure out an enrichment situation for that bird. Some of the birds that I've worked with have been birds that have had old injuries, so maybe they can't fly very well, or they can't perch very well. So thinking about that with enrichment, with my bird who had a wing injury, I'm going to be really careful about how high up off the ground I might have perches, or if I have toys that maybe I'll avoid certain toys that would cause them to swing around and swing upside down and perhaps injure that wing again. Or I would invoke training that prevented them from feeling the need to flee, because if they are fleeing and trying to get away, they may injure themselves again. And remember that we were wanting to promote wanted behaviors, and we want to avoid promoting unwanted behaviors. So when we're talking about foraging, we may be talking, or when we're talking about these toys, thinking about our talk earlier today, where we're looking at, okay, what behaviors are we specifically trying to promote? And looking at those for the particular individual. So for example, if I had a patient who was doing some feather destructive behaviors, I might give them enrichment that was targeted towards them using their mouths in other ways. Now, that may not prevent them, if it's a behavioral feather destructive behavior, that may not get rid of that behavior. But if we can get them to spend more time using their beak with other things, they're going to spend less time doing it on themselves. So that's one of the things I think about is how do we get them to engage in the environment in a way that's productive for what we're trying to do? I already talked about this a little bit, the enclosure, the size, the orientation, the location, day versus night. So one of the things that is very important, which I do see a lot with my patients, is that I do see that most of these birds are fairly equatorial. So that means that, for a lot of the year, they're getting 12, especially during breeding season, but especially throughout the year, they're getting sort of 12 hours in the morning, 12 hours a day, 12 hours a night. And so what's happening is that a lot of the birds that we see, I think, are suffering from sleep deprivation because they are not getting that full amount of sleep at night. Because maybe they have their night location, but maybe it's in the living room and the TV is still going on. So it's really important for people to have their birds' night location in a really quiet place and have it covered so that they do have that full 12 hours of sleep, which they need. For adequate perches, again, that's a big one for birds of different sizes. I really like having a combination of size appropriate dowels or other fixed size perches in combination with ones that are more natural. Because the ones that are more natural will allow the bird to kind of pick and choose where it is that they want to stay and pick and choose what's most comfortable for them. So I like providing that variety for them because that does give them more choice, more options. Um, just to review some of the things that others have already talked about, tactile enrichment, things like bells, balls, chewing items, ropes. areas to explore. Again, if I have a bird who is really showing a lot of destructive behavior outside of their enclosure, I would be encouraging the client to figure out what sort of chew items would be appropriate for that bird so that they can go ahead and chew on that instead of chewing on the door jamb. And it gives them an area, and it gives them areas for exploration and things to explore. For citizens especially, they're very attracted to color, and certain birds seem to be attracted to certain colors. So I will talk to clients who say, "Oh yeah, my bird really likes the color red." I'll have another client who says, bird really likes the color yellow." So learning preferences can really help attract a bird to a particular toy. Um, And then also considering the colors around the enclosure. Some birds, if there's a lot of color around the enclosure, that can be very positively stimulating for them. Some birds, it's really frightening. So I had one bird that the client brought in a striped pillow, and that was it. The bird would not come out of its cage. When she got rid of the striped pillow, everything was fine. So it's really important to, again, watch the bird's behavior and look at where they're paying attention to, look at the stress behaviors that they're showing so that we can help them be as comfortable as possible. There's been some recent studies looking at communication with birds via tablets, which I thought was really fascinating. So birds can engage with tablets, like iPads, things like that. And so there can be some enrichment opportunities there as well. Auditory enrichment, again, music. A lot of people play music, nature sounds, animal sounds, radio. Of course, when you're working with animals who do tend to copy what people say and copy the animal sounds, you may want to have a little bit of caution as to what sounds you expose them to, because you may or may not want elephant sounds 24 hours a day when your bird is getting really worked up about something. So, just be aware that some of these birds love to mimic. So be careful what you expose them to, because you'll probably hear it back. So remember also that when we are considering environmental change for these birds, when I'm working with when I'm working with birds that are in the pet environment, I would say that while I do work with some clients who do have a lot of enrichment, they're not able to give the amount of enrichment that these birds would be if they were in the wild. Um, and I can't remember who it was who told me this, and I really am sorry about this, but thinking about these birds as basically think of them as animals that are in a zoo that we need to enrich. So rather than thinking of them as your companion, sometimes we need to take a step back and think of these as, okay, if this is a bird who was in a zoo environment, what could we do to enrich them? And sometimes that gives clients a little bit of a different mindset on how the important enrichment is for these birds. But a lot of these birds maybe haven't had a lot of enrichment, or they haven't had enrichment that's changed recently, or maybe they haven't had much of exposure to things since they were young. So we need to give really slow changes. If we're going to introduce something that's sort of similar to something that they already know about, something that's not going to frighten them. Make it something that maybe they can look at it from a distance first before you gradually start bringing it closer. And again, using those individual preferences to really try to facilitate that interaction with these individual birds. Something that One of the things that and this may be controversial depending on who you might be speaking to. I know that a couple of the other presenters talked about the benefits of having nest boxes for breeding or non-breeding individuals. Um, in my population of birds that I work with, several of the birds that I've worked with have had um, reproductive type behaviors and breeding type behaviors that were interfering in the relationship that the person and the bird were having, aggressive behaviors and such. So in a lot of cases, actually advocate for removing nest boxes or nesting materials and floor access, because oftentimes those do cause or start facilitating some of these behaviors that then lead to problems with the relationship with the people. So I just wanted to put it there that that is sometimes something that can be helpful in some of these birds' cases. And diet can have a direct influence on unwanted behavior, especially mating and breeding behaviors. If you have a bird, so we already talked a little bit about nutrition earlier today, I believe, but talking about, we want to make sure that we have a lot of fresh fruits. We want to have pellets for things being well, so that the nutrition is well-rounded for the particular bird. We want to have some grains. We want it to be low fat, low carb if possible, because when we have high fats and high carbs, that actually tends to put these birds into more of a breeding, don't want to say mindset, but makes them physiologically ready to breed. So that can lead to other mating type, breeding type behaviors that can be problematic for when our clients are trying to interact with them. And by those, like I mentioned, aggressive behavior, you can have actual courtship behaviors, masturbatory behaviors, all these behaviors that are related to mating and breeding that can be disruptive to the human-animal bond. So this is chop that's around the side here. Basically a mixture of grains, a little bit of grains, a lot of greens, some veggies are sprinkled in there too. So really nice also for them to forage through. You can put pellets in there. You can even put some seeds in there. I'm not saying you shouldn't give seeds at all, but it should be a small portion of what they're getting. But you can use something like chop and put seeds in there so they have to hunt around. Ideally, they're eating all of the chop. That's a whole different conversation. But you can also use that as a way to hide other things. And like I've been sort of hinting at before, foraging and foraging type behaviors are really important, in my opinion, for these birds, because wild parrots do spend 60% or more of their day foraging. So they're flying miles and miles to get to these places. And then they're spending hours over the course of the day foraging. And if you can think of these birds in the home, maybe they get some food and maybe it's in a bowl and they pick through their food. Maybe they pick out the stuff that they like the best and throw the rest of it away. But then in, 5-10 minutes, maybe they're done. And then it's like, okay, now what do I do? And so this is where if we can get these pet birds foraging, especially, and working on finding food in a more productive way that's species typical, it is really, really, really important for their welfare. And so if I have clients where sometimes clients are very overwhelmed with all the things that they can do. So I always start off with, let's get some foraging happening. Let's get it so that they're having to work a little bit for their food. Maybe we even start with just one of those little like a little ketchup cup that you get at fast food restaurants, or a little Dixie cup, something like that you can cut the Dixie cup in half, or, the ketchup cup in half. I guess Dixie cups have some wax on them, but you can put that and then of their favorite nut in there and then like squish it a little bit shut. So they have to figure out how to get it out. And then the next time they squish it a little bit more shut and then a little bit more shut. And then maybe you can tie something around it, or maybe you can put one inside the other. And so you can start building it up so that they have to start figuring out, how do I get that nut out? How do I get these things which I love out? So that's a really important part of enrichment for the clients that I have, really starting to get them foraging, because that's probably the big place where many of my clients are lacking. So again, thinking about if we have multiple birds, what sort of interaction do they have? If it's a single bird in the home, then they got to have interactions with somebody that's positive, because these birds are flock animals, right? I mean, you've seen the videos where there's hundreds of them together, depending on the species, but the vast majority of these birds are flock animals. So if they don't have others of their own species, then they need to have social interactions with others, and it needs to be appropriate and positive. And thinking about positive, just thinking about what is positive for a particular bird. So as a human, we may be thinking that, going up and snuggling the bird might be positive because we are feeling it's positive. However, the bird, when the person's approaching, might be leaning away. They might be tolerating that interaction, but they may not be actually enjoying it. And that's where it's really important, where for people to understand that tolerance is not the same as comfort. So it's really important for people to understand that the bird needs to be an active participant and actually asking for this interaction. So one of the things that I have my clients do is I call it consent and the 3-second rule. With consent, what I'm asking for is if you have a bird that you think that you get along with, then maybe offer your hand or sometimes people give a little cue that they're going to give a scratch. So give a cue that you're interested in engaging with the bird and see, does your bird come up to you and actively ask for that engagement? If they come up and then butt their heads against you or, butt their necks against you, then go ahead and pet them, but do it for 3 seconds. So literally count in your head 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, and then stop and see, does the bird re-engage? If the bird re-engages, then pet for another 3 seconds and then stop. And then see, does the bird re-engage again? Sometimes birds really enjoy social interaction, but they enjoy it at a distance. Sometimes they like calling back and forth to you. Sometimes they enjoy being near you, but they don't want to be touched. Sometimes they do enjoy being petted, but having them have that autonomy to be able to tell you what they want to do is really, really important. A lot of times a bird will come up, they maybe want to be petted for 3 seconds and they want to hang out near you, but they don't want to be touched. So if they don't engage with you, don't reach for them. Let them be the ones to really make that first step. Because the more comfortable they feel, and if they realize that, wait, they have a say in this, then they are actually going to have more confidence in interacting with you. So think about what is positive for that individual bird. And then also avoid snuggling or other courtship type behaviors. So I know a lot of people, especially who have cockatoos, they really like to snuggle because cockatoos, oh my gosh, they are snuggly birds, right? And but the problem is that when you start snuggling them and petting them all along their bodies, then you're doing a lot of facilitation of courtship behaviors, which then can lead to that bird possibly thinking you're their, kind of acting like you're their mate, which then can lead to other behavior problems. So just be aware of that snuggling and courtship behaviors may not be the best option for them. Because remember, these guys are wild birds, right? I mean, they're not wild in that most of these birds have been raised in captivity. However, they're not domesticated. We also want to avoid punishment or negative reinforcement. Now, I brought this up because there's a lot of information on the internet about what punishment and negative reinforcement are. So just to kind of go over briefly, punishment is anything that decreases the likelihood of some sort of behavior. So for example, an example of punishment might be if a bird bites and then you flick them on the beak. The idea is that you flick them on the beak, that's going to decrease the likelihood they're going to bite again. So that would be a punishment. Another idea is that a lot of people, if there's a bird that's sitting on them and the bird bites, they'll like drop the hand to make it be kind of be unsteady. So the idea being they bite, the hand drops, and the bird says, "Oh, I didn't like that," and that'll decrease the likelihood of biting. Negative reinforcement means that you do something that the bird's not really comfortable with or doesn't really like until they do what you want, and then you stop that. So for example, if you have a bird and then you're pushing into their chest, you keep pushing, and this is how a lot of birds are taught, right? You push into their chest until they're unbalanced enough that they step up, and then you stop pushing. So they start realizing is they're like, oh, well, I see that hand coming. I better step up before it starts pushing me off balance. So that's negative reinforcement. With punishment and negative reinforcement, let me see if it's on the next slide or not. Okay. With punishment and negative reinforcement, the things that are important to keep in mind are that the birds are changing their behavior to avoid something they don't like or that they don't find pleasant. You may not be hurting them, but you may be doing something they're just like not happy about. And so when you do this, the problem is that anything that changes behavior can also carry with it an emotional price tag, basically. So when you have, if you have a bird that you flick the beak for every time they bite, maybe they'll stop biting, but do you think that they're going to be any more comfortable seeing this hand coming towards them? Probably not. Because even though birds are really smart, they can start making that association of, oh, yeah, I mean, yeah, I kind of get this idea that I bit and something happened, but that hand is what caused it to happen. So now I need to be a little bit more worried about this hand. So what can start happening is that we can start having what's called conditioned emotional responses. So this is moving into classical conditioning and some of the learning theory. You can have learned negative emotional responses that occur when you have punishment and negative reinforcement that's used, especially strong punishment and negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement can be used in ways that are minimally stressful and can be beneficial. However, in the vast majority of cases, they're unfortunately not used that way. So I always err on the side of caution, especially when I'm starting with a patient, that we're avoiding punishment, we're avoiding negative reinforcement. What we're going to do is we're going to work with, as much as possible, positive reinforcement. We're working with rewards. We're going to work on things that are going to condition positive emotional responses so that this bird is actually comfortable with what we're trying to do. So often improving enrichment is sufficient to improve a parrot's welfare and behavior. It's amazing sometimes when we get a bird that hasn't been taught how to forage and who's screaming all day, and we get them to start foraging and we give them items that's going to keep them going for a couple hours, then that not only keeps their beak occupied so they're not screaming as much, but that's also working their brain. That's making them a little bit more tired. Maybe they're going to take a little bit of a nap. So this can be so beneficial for these birds, but sometimes it's not enough. And so what I start thinking about, sort of going back to the enrichment and the diet, I then start thinking about, okay, what are some of the other things that we want to consider? So management is avoiding or preventing the problem behaviors from occurring. So the reasons for this is to prevent rehearsal of the behavior problems. Because practice makes perfect, right? The more often that they practice an unwanted behavior, the stronger it's going to get. Also from safety, we know how, I always look at that picture in that previous slide of the bird pinching the ear, and I'm just like, oh, these birds have some major beaks on them and claws on them. So there's a really easy chance to get injured with these birds if we're not careful. And then we want to help set up the ability to teach an alternate behavior. And so I wanted to give a couple of examples on how we might do management. So here is a video that I took recently. And oh, do we have the whole video here? Okay, so this is a bird. It's kind of not wanting to play very well. There we go. So this is a bird who has a history of showing aggressive behavior towards people. And so what we're doing in this case, let's see if I can, is we're doing what's called protected contact. So those of you in the zoo world know protected contact. So what we're doing is we're working to teach this bird that that this person approaching and giving treats is something that's positive for her. So what we're doing is we're setting up an ability to teach an alternate behavior in a safe way, where the bird is feeling safe and the person is feeling safe. So for example, here's an example. This was a bird who was showing some aggressive behavior towards people. So where we started was, all right, she's in her enclosure. We're outside the enclosure, so there's no way that anyone's going to get injured. We talked about how to deliver the treat to her in a way that is going to make it unlikely that she's going to be able to bite. And so, and the way that we had done that was you can see there it's square, it's like square wire on this one. And so basically what we did was we held the treat such that the bird would need to kind of come around the wire to be able to grasp it. And so it would make it really hard for her to bite, basically. And so she would grasp it and then she would like transfer it and move it and manipulate it after we let it go. and then pull it back into a cage. So there's various ways that you can set it up so that you can have it for a smaller bird. If you have, if you have a little sprig of seeds, you can give a little seed and like hand out the sprig, they grab one of the seeds and then take it back. So there's a variety of ways that you can do this. So you might do behaviors within, you might start teaching with a bird who is showing a strong level of aggressive behavior. Maybe we're starting behaviors while they're inside their enclosure and teaching them certain behaviors and managing it so they can't practice that aggressive behavior. Similar for courtship behaviors, some of the things I mentioned before, maybe we don't have a nesting area. Maybe we prevent them from going onto the floor because that's one of the things that's correlated with some of these behaviors. Maybe we don't allow them to get under the sofa and like find little hidey holes, like their own nesting areas. And then, so we saw that already. And then behavior modification, when we're working with these birds, it focuses not just on the behavior that the bird is showing, but also the emotional state of that behavior. So kind of thinking back to those 5 domains, emotional health was one of them, right? And so we want to think about, or the mental health was one of them, and mental health and emotional state are very closely linked. So that's why we focus on positively reinforcing wanted behaviors. So using treats, using play, using something that, if this bird really, really likes being scritched on the head, that could be a positive reinforcer. But we want to reinforce wanted behaviors, but then we want to prevent unwanted behaviors through management. Rather than trying to punish them for doing what we don't want them to do, let's try to keep them from doing it through setting up their environment, and then let's reinforce the behaviors that we want. So we want to avoid pressuring, pushing them. We don't need to take the bite. I see that a lot on the internet, or when I talk to clients, they're like, I just take the bite. You don't have to. You don't have to do that. There are ways that we can work. You don't have to be taking the bite, because that's not good for you. And it's also not good for the bird because the bird is learning that that's what they should do. And then in certain situations, if there's a strong emotional response associated with this, especially a strong fear or a strong arousal related response, we may need to do gradual desensitization and counter conditioning. Gradual desensitization and counter conditioning is a gradual and systematic exposure to a stimulus of concern, while you then promote a positive emotional response. So for example, if you're wanting to do target training with a bird, let's say, so target training is where you have maybe a chopstick or some other pointer of some sort, and you put it somewhere and the bird goes to the tip and touches it. So it's a great way that you can get an animal to move from one place to the other without having to touch them. And chopsticks are a really common one that's used with birds. But the bird may be scared of chopsticks. So maybe what you do first is you show them the chopstick far away where they notice it, but they're not scared of it, and then they get a treat. So every time they see the chopstick from 5 feet away, let's say, they get a treat every time they look. And they're like, so and they start thinking about, well, this chopstick, there's something really good that happens whenever I see it. And then you can start gradually bringing it closer and closer every time you bring it a little, and then when you bring it a little bit closer, they look at it and then they're not fearful. They get a little something, they get a treat, they get some sort of something that conditions a positive emotional response. And then eventually you might be able to get them to touch it, and then they get some rewards for that. And then now that they're comfortable with it, you can then start using it for training. So that's so generally what desensitization and counter conditioning is. Similarly, if you have a cat, excuse me, whoa, my brain just went kind of fizzed right there. If you have a bird that's afraid of hands coming and hands coming towards them, then you may start with the hand far away, and they get a treat, and then maybe it comes a little bit closer and a little bit closer. There are a few different ways around, there's a few different strategies around this, but this is sort of the most basic of the strategies that you would do, but it can be more complicated than that. But that's the general idea, is that you're exposing them to the thing that worries them, but doing it in a gradual way so that you don't ever elicit a fearful response. What we don't want to do, which does happen a lot, is flooding. Flooding occurs where you put the bird in the situation that scares them and they really can't get away. So that is where, the bird who maybe can't fly is on a perch, and then people come up and just start petting it, and they're kind of leaning away, but can't really get away. So they're scared and they're stressed, and maybe that particular bird's temperament is not such that it shows aggressive behavior, but it's really scared as well. And so that can show, that's flooding, where they're being exposed to this negative stimulus and they can't do anything about it. And that does not promote a positive emotional response. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out on the internet about that as well, under the name of desensitization and counter conditioning. So true desensitization and counter conditioning, these birds should not be showing stress responses. Sometimes these birds are too scared, or they're showing true abnormal behavior. So sometimes stereotypic behaviors where birds are just, stereotypically moving back and forth. Sometimes when we do have behavior-related, stress-related feather destructive behavior or self-mutilatory behavior. Sometimes when we have birds that are showing who maybe are going on a trip and they're really scared of travel. They've never been outside of their home before, perhaps. Some of these birds may need to have some more help to help them through this. And so this is where behavioral medications come in. The things to keep in mind with behavioral medications are that there's not a whole lot of information that's out there on birds with behavioral of all the species. There's information on certain birds, and I'm not going to go into that today, but there's not a whole lot of direct information. So sometimes we need to extrapolate between species. And then, like I was saying, these can, and usually it's done as a liquid. And so you can teach birds to take liquid medications. And so, that's part of what we might want to do is some desensitization and counter conditioning around taking medications. But again, we use that in situations of fear or over arousal where triggers are unavoidable. If we have a bird who's terrified of everybody in the house, and they're flapping in their enclosure, trying to get away whenever anybody approaches with food. This is a bird that's really, really terrified. So in a case like that, perhaps behavioral medications might be of help. Or if an emotion is prolonged or exaggerated, or when the emotional signs are prolonged or exaggerated, that's where behavioral medications can be helpful as well. There are some quick acting medications. So I've, in general, in my behavior practice, I've used gabapentin for birds. In the hospital, there are other medications that you can use that are quick acting. The big thing that you have to be aware of is that with birds, especially if you're doing something at the home, you want to make sure that it's something that doesn't cause them to become sedated, because we don't want them falling off of their perches. So we have to be careful about that. But gabapentin is a quick acting medication. It takes about 2 hours to take effect. And then as far as maintenance medications for sort of general anxiety relief, those are medications like paroxetine, fluoxetine, clomipramine. There are others also that have been studied, but there is help out there if you have a bird who is having behavioral concerns, that behavioral enrichment, management, behavior modification, if these are not helping, or if you as a trainer are assessing a bird and you're like, wow, this bird's reaction is way stronger than what I would expect, or it's not progressing in the way that I would expect, speak to your veterinarian or veterinary behaviorist sooner rather than later, because the sooner we can help reduce that anxiety, then the quicker we're going to be able to have success. Of course, keeping in mind just the caveats around working with birds in general. So my take homes for you are that, environmental enrichment, an appropriate environmental enrichment is vital for parrot welfare. I think that's what this entire day has been talking about, is enrichment is so vital for these birds. And so thinking about how you can tailor it for the individual bird and the behaviors that you're trying to prevent and the behaviors you're trying to promote. Sometimes enrichment can be enough to reduce most of these problem behaviors, but if not, there is help that is out there through management, behavior modification, potentially behavioral medication as well. So don't lose heart, don't lose hope. I know of birds that have been in small cages their entire lives because of aggressive behavior. It doesn't have to be that way. There's help out there. But thank you so much for listening to me today, and I hope that was helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you in the panel discussion. Thank you so much, everyone.